Hello and welcome to Superhero Ethics. Today we're talking with Paul Hoppy about the question of, in a world of powered people, what happens to the people without powers? We're going to be looking at this in specific in regard to a couple of pieces of media, especially Avatar, The Legend of Korra, as well as The Boys and X-Men and a couple others I'm sure we'll talk about. But whether you've seen all of those or none of those, we're going to make sure there's a conversation for everyone, because if you've ever been part of a superhero conversation, if you've ever been watched a superhero story where some people have powers, the question comes up, what about the powers? What about the people who don't? All that and more right after this commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew. I'm one of your hosts. I'm joined again by Paul Hoppy, who was the original co-host, the host of this podcast with me back in the day, as well as the inspiration for it, because a lot of this came out of conversations Paul and I would have while taking a, I can't call it a dinner break, but a food break at 2 a.m. while at a casino. And there's at least one time I remember where we were both doing good at the poker tables, but the conversation was so good we didn't want to go back and keep playing for a while. But yeah, so Paul, it's great to have you back. I'm glad you kind of become a little more semi-regular again, and good to have you here for this discussion. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. Yeah, it's good to be back. It's morning, which, I guess is when most people eat breakfast. But we'll try to be alert and coherent.
Paul and I actually brought back that old tradition. We were playing a game of poker last night with some friends, old and new, over Zoom and electronically. So it's kind of putting it all back into perspective. Now, I want to say to you fans, you guys have been fantastic. We did a big push for reviews, especially on iTunes, and a number of you wrote in. I wanted to read one or two more of those to say thank you. The first comes from, the name is ALSBSIWNDHD. So Paul's going to go ahead and try to pronounce that now.
Alswinded?
I think possibly. I have no idea what it is, but I appreciate your review. He said, this show is basically the kind of conversation that I have with the boys during the credits of the theater. I think, yeah, that makes me so happy, because that's exactly what we were kind of going for. Like, this started from, like, Paul and I, having these conversations, and my having a gigantic ego and thinking, like, of course everybody else would want to hear our conversation, so let's broadcast it. T. Nozzle writes, you guys are super freaking good. Love the debates of almost all ethics. Great show. Love when Jeff and Matt are on it also. They're from the MCU Cast and Stranded Panda Podcast Network. So thank you so much for that. Also, last one, Follow Fabe writes, great in-depth angles at the morals involved, or lack thereof, of the world in the world of comics. So thank you so much. Please keep sending in those reviews. We always love to hear them. Keep sending in feedback. We will. I'm always happy when we get emails. We can try and read our Facebook comments. So we can read them on air and talk about them. But so let's now get into the topic that we want to talk about. And it's a little bit amorphous, and especially because I think we want the focus to be on the topic itself, not just the media we're discussing. Although the conversation, I think, was, for me especially, really inspired by Season 1 of Avatar, The Legend of Korra. And so we'll talk more about what that is in a bit. I'll say that we are going to definitely spoil pretty much everything from that season. We'll make reference to TV shows like The Boys, though I'm going to try there to, we might spoil like individual funny moments or interesting moments, but try not to spoil the big plot points. And there'll probably be a couple of other pieces of media that we talk about, but Korra is the main one we'll be spoiling. But the heart of the topic...
Possibly a little bit of the original series, the Last Airbender.
Oh yeah, probably. I think that's definitely true. If we're talking about Korra,
maybe the very end even.
Yeah,
because it seems very relevant.
Yeah, so probably the very end, but we'll try and give you some spoiler warnings. We're about to talk about that. But yeah, so I think that the heart of this topic is, and it's one that I've always really thought about and always been interested in, which is okay, you now have a whole bunch of people in your world who have powers. What happens to everybody else? What are the rights of everybody else? What happens? How do you treat these people by law enforcement, or by what's the issues of collateral damage? And I always used to be kind of frustrated that we never saw stories covering that. More recently, we've been getting a lot of that. We've been getting the Netflix Defenders shows, especially Jessica Jones, have talked some about this in terms of like, how do you legally treat people with superpowers? The X-Men, I think, has always talked about this to some extent, with both Magneto and Professor X both being concerned about what are the non-powered people going to do. But in almost all of those cases, it's still the point of view characters are the people with powers. And I think it's very interesting to think about, like, how does the way they tell those stories, do they make the people without powers seem sympathetic? Do they make them not? The Boys is one of the only ones I know of where the point of view characters are not the people with powers, which I think is part of what makes it an interesting part of this conversation. But yeah, it all just kind of comes back to these questions of what happens in these worlds? What happens to the law? What happens to sports and athletics and celebrity? What happens to the class divisions that are caused? So let me just kind of start by throwing it out to you as kind of just a general thing. Paul, what's been is this something that you've been thinking about a lot, that you were thinking about watching superhero stuff? Where does the idea of what happens to the non-powered people come up for you?
It is something that I've given a lot of thought before The Boys came out, and I mean this episode isn't about The Boys, but the I think when I watched the first season of Korra, I didn't think as much about it at the time. I mean, I think generally what writers do in worlds like this is they create a token unpowered character. Yeah. We'll call them a Xander.
That's a really good point.
And, I mean, although, in that case, actually, there was only one powered character kind of to begin with, and then everybody ends up with powers, basically. But, like, right. I think it's often treated like the characters, characters having powers is what seems interesting at first, right? It's the element of, the whole world can be fiction, but that's the element of the world that separates it, especially in these types of worlds that are like pretty much like our own, but then there are people with powers. And so those were sort of, I think, the default viewpoint characters, right? And I mean, I remember even just going back to like playing World of Darkness games and feeling like there was so little, like, what were the regular people doing? It seemed like every character was like a vampire or a mage or a werewolf or something, right? Yeah. And I always felt there was something lacking by not actually having much representation for the entire rest of the world. Right. But, it's like, who wants to play a human when, you can be someone with powers or even a human with powers? So I think it's difficult because I think once you give some characters powers, I think the audience is often going to sort of gravitate towards like, oh, that's such a cool power. I wish I had that power. I kind of want to be one of those characters. As opposed to making them kind of a force in the world, but, not the protagonists. Sort of like the way like so many shows and so much fiction centers around like really rich characters, Yeah. And I mean, even like you look at a Game of Thrones and it's like, well, yeah, not all the characters have powers per se, but most of the characters are born into positions of power, and it's like a struggle between all of them. And
most of them have the training of knightly combat. Like they've grown up being trained to be fighters in a way that your average peasant would never have. And that's certainly like the ability to ride a horse and use a sword and fire a bow and arrow is kind of a superpower in that world, for sure.
Right. And just the access to, resources as well, right? And so it's really interesting when a show like Korra goes ahead and, the first season is about sort of this tension between people with powers and people without powers. And the tricky thing is that it's a world that it's not like a world where there's this like few people with powers, right? It's like a big, like the national identity of the four nations that existed before this series, right? Before
and let me actually break in here because, like I said, I'm sure some of our listeners have not seen Legend of Korra, and we're going to spoil some of this first season, but some folks may not want to watch it, but still be interested in this conversation. So let me just give like a quick summary of what's happening in that. And again, it's going to be very brief. Please don't add us with all the little details we missed, because I'm sure I will make broad generalizations. But the world of Avatar, and again, we're going to go back to the more general discussion, but because we're going to be referencing Korra, let's just fill this in now. The world of Avatar is one in which, as Paul said, the world is divided up into 4 nations, and in those 4 nations, they have an identity around a specific element, earth, air, fire, or water, and that there are certain people called benders who basically have a kind of magic, basically, or like spirit power, to bend that element, so that water benders can, like, bring water out of the ground and shoot it at people and form ice and, build ice castles or fire, incredibly sharp, crystal knives at people. Or even, as we find, affect the water in someone's blood and control them like a marionette puppet. Airbenders control air, and they can fly, and they can, send gusts of air at people. Firebenders, are basically, invocation wizards from D&D with really good fireballs and other spells like that.
And they can heat tea.
Yeah, they can heat tea, and power like balloons and stuff like that. And then Earthbenders are they control, the earth, and they can like bring out, they can build incredible buildings. They can lift up rocks and throw them at people. And then later, some of them become to actually metal bend because metal is connected to the earth. And so, for most of the story, we get just about how the benders doing what they're doing, they're heroes. We meet non-benders, but there isn't any discussion of that. In the Legend of Korra, in the first season, the heart of the story is that there's this group called the Equalizers who are very concerned about the fact that the benders have all this power and all this, and I think the best word for it, honestly, is privilege. And that the Equalists are very concerned about the fact that there is that this is a very unbalanced world, and that the Equalists feel like they're always getting pushed around and all this kind of stuff. And so they're set up as the main antagonist. And we'll get into how they're treated, because I think I certainly, and I think Paul also maybe, but certainly myself, is not very happy with the way that story is told, because I think it puts an interesting spin on this powered, non-powered discussion that we'll definitely get into. But that's just so that people understand what we're referencing. Like, that, the Legend of Korra is definitely about the split between powered and non-powered people. In that first season, it's told very much from the perspective of the powered people in a way that pretty much seems to be much more on the side of the powered people, for a number of reasons that we'll get into later. But, so, just giving out that context, and then, like, we can pull back to the general discussion. And because I think you're right, Paul, I think that there is some really interesting conversations to be had there about, I mean, I kind of always have this issue with superhero stuff that, like, I love superheroes, but I hate fight scenes.
Right.
What I want is, like, a 4-hour exploration of the sociology of a world in which superpowers exist.
Yeah.
But I think it's again, shows like The Boys and Korra are getting into that. One thing I think is interesting is that in both of those, like, the sporting events that happen are all basically only for powered people. Because, like, and there's also, there's a series of young adult books by Brandon Sanderson, who's a very prolific fantasy and science fiction type writer. And they go even more, so they're called the Reckoners. And the whole idea of this is that all the powered people are pretty much evil, and this is about, like, the non-powered people trying to fight back. And the first book is pretty good. They kind of, I think, betray the concept and go off a cliff in later books, as well as being horrifically sexist. But the point is, like, one of the things they establish is that, like, once a person can run superhumanly fast, the idea of seeing how fast a normal person could run, no one cares anymore. No one cares how much could a normal person lift or how high can a normal person jump, because you got superheroes who can blow it all out of the water. And it talks in the book about the idea that has kind of a deadening effect of, like, if you're not a superhero, what do you have to strive for? Why do you want to try to become faster? Why do you want to try to become stronger? And so that's just a kind of example of the kind of thing that is interesting is, that's not even talking about the legalists. You're talking about, like, what happens to the people who don't have powers in a world where the people who have powers are so glorified and lifted up?
It's interesting that, the sports sort of thing, right? Like, in the real world, computers can play chess better than humans can, and that's been true for decades now, right? But people still watch humans play chess, and I know a lot of people might be being like, they do? Yeah, they do. And it's become a really big thing online, too. And, there's been a surge in the popularity of the game. And, you know, similarly, poker, computers can play certain parts of poker or certain variants better than humans possibly can. And people still play. So I guess I would push back a little bit against the assumption that, you know, it's true that if, you know, and granted, computers aren't the same as, you know, say a superhumanly powerful human, but, you know, like, all right, so it's like people watch the WNBA, right? And people watch the NBA, and I don't think they have exactly equal ratings, but some of that is like, who do we watch and why? I think some of that is it's cultural, right? It's not all going to be just like, you know, if you only want to see the best play against the best all the time, like maybe you'd only have two teams. Yeah. And
I mean, I think that's why I think it's interesting, is that it's with any of those, like, we can't predict in any way what would happen to a world with people who have powers. So we offer ideas, and I think you're right. This is one interesting idea. It's not by any. I don't think it's 100% guaranteed that would happen. I would offer just the counterpoint to what you're saying is that because you're right, people still do watch, and like chess, people probably still play, and poker. Yeah. There has been a lot of really good data around the idea that. You know, 50 years ago, sports were on the radio or maybe televised, but were nowhere near as popular. And a lot of people took part in, you know, like their company softball team and stuff like that. Right. And those things have faded quite dramatically. They're coming back a little bit now with some like backlash, but like there was definitely a movement of like, don't play, watch these better people.
Right.
But
yeah. And so I guess my point would not be that wouldn't happen or can't happen. It definitely can happen. We know it can happen. But my point is more that it also could not happen, and that that a lot of it's societal, cultural. Yeah. That like we can in our own world create a world where people are interested in watching a broader range of people competing, right? Just the same way that in a fictional world, you know, they could still have sports where you're not allowed to bend, right? Like that could be a thing. And
I mean, and even here, Korra, but she's the character known as the Avatar, and the Avatar are the one character on the whole planet who is able to bend multiple elements. Generally, like if you're an Earthbender, you can't touch anything else. The Avatar can bend numerous things. And no one's ever thought about the idea of the Avatar taking part in the sport before. And so because the sport involves numerous people bending at each other. So again, it's a sport that non-benders literally can't play. They can't even like play in their backyard and pretend to be. But they actually make a specific rule for Korra that she can only bend one element while in the sport. Which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, which I mean, I guess sort of seems reasonable. But like...
She's also the person who the spirits have decided will be the best bender at all four, so there's already kind of a problem.
So it's also kind of maybe not reasonable, like.
But I think actually what you're saying of like that it could be this way, but it doesn't have to be.
Exactly.
It is kind of, I think, going to the heart of at least what I want to talk about this episode, because it's, I think, if you have a world with powered people and unpowered people, and there's no thought to that, I think a classed society where the power becomes an incredible privilege with all the powers that privileges has, is not inevitable, but is very, very likely.
Yes.
And that what you'd need is a society that really does some actual thought on how can we have athletic events that involve, you know, these other things? How can we, if we have a world where some people run around reading people's minds, but we have things like poker where the ability to keep a secret is essential to the game, how do you, like, limit when a person can read someone else's mind without, like, you know, treating those people horribly. And I guess that's to me some of the interesting stories is how do you say our society is built around the idea that, well, let me put it this way. I think we all tell ourselves that our society is built around the idea that everyone is fundamentally the same, and so we all have the same rights and the same privileges. I think that's a complete myth. And the reality is there's vast differences based on, you know, your race, your gender, the amount of money you have, the privilege you have, the background you have. But there's at least some idea. I mean, like, you know, we are all fairly genetically close in terms of like, a genetic outlier can maybe run pretty darn fast, but there's still certain human limits. But these shows are saying like, yeah, let's take that question of we're not as equal a society as we think we are, and really blow it out to proportions and say, what happens to a society when some people are so much more powered than others?
Yeah, crank that idea up to like 1100, basically. And I mean, I feel like I don't have a lot of super good answers. You know, I mean, I have some ideas in the real world that we can make things more equitable, and I mean, people have been pondering the question for hundreds of years, thousands of years. I mean, in terms of when people have just these really just like outsized powers where it seems like everybody in the, you know, the Avatar world is either born with the ability to bend or born without the ability to bend.
Right.
And if you want to try and make people more equal in power, it seems like nobody's really given a whole lot of thought to how to teach non-benders to bend. Like, is that possible even?
Sure, the implication seems to be that it's not possible.
Right.
There is an idea that, like, there's a crazy plot thing that can happen where people get powers, bending powers later in life, but it's nothing that they do. It's still just as random.
Right. So then the other solution is like, do you just try to remove everybody's powers who has powers? And that also, to me, I mean, the first one seems like a good solution to me, but it doesn't have a, like, you know, ideally, I think if we can elevate everybody to where they have, where they basically have as much, where they reach their potential, where they, you know, I mean, we look at these powers, right? And within the context of the shows, I'd say for the majority of the time, they're portrayed as these destructive combat powers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sure, in the original series, Aang mostly uses air to evade people and stuff like that. And, you know, you can use metal bending to restrain people instead of, like, sending a sword through their heart or whatever. But generally, they're these combat powers. But, I mean, when you think about, you know, power over the elements, it's like that, you know, can be extremely constructive, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, earthbenders can build a city in hours, right? So, you know, the idea of just like trying to remove everyone's powers seems, first of all, to be removing abilities that can be used for good, and then second of all, also really, you know, removing an aspect of someone's identity. Like, most of the people who are benders identify very heavily as being benders. What's interesting is that there's these 4 nations that were basically built around benders, and the people in those nations who are non-benders still identify with that element.
Right.
And that's something that I think, you know, could be interesting to, like, delve into, like, why do they identify with that element? Like, do they actually have some connection that's not the ability to bend, but that, you know, that actually is connected with their identity? Or is it just kind of like, you know, well, that's, you know, I'm around some people who can bend this element, and so so they've basically told me for that to be my identity, essentially.
Yeah. It's a really interesting thing, and I mean, even to some extent, like, I love what you said about, like, how people are raised. If you're a bender, you kind of think that's the central part of your identity, and, like, that losing it would be really devastating. I mean, to some extent, that's not very healthy. Like, and
right,
here again,
totally.
like, if you keep running with this idea, The Boys especially does this, but I think you can apply it to any of these things, where the way people with powers are treated is kind of a metaphor for the way, like, celebrities are treated. Like, you know, think about, like, people who are professional athletes. Like, in this day and age, at least, they're probably identified as being, like, athletic prodigies, as well as, like, genetic, like, just, I want to say mutations. That's not, but, like, you know,
outliers.
Genetically, like, significant genetic outliers.
Yeah.
They're identified as that as, like, at age 10.
Right.
And, like, they didn't spend, like, not always, but a lot of the time, like, a lot of their childhood, like, all their time is on Little League, and then they go to college, and they, like, are focused entirely on this. And then you hear these stories about someone who like blows out their knee or like something else happens and their athletic career ends, and they have no idea what to do with themselves.
Right.
And that's what I thought of when you talked about like, for a Bender, but I mean the same thing like for an X-Men. Like in some of my favorite stories about the X-Men, they do explore like what if you could voluntarily give up your powers.
Yeah.
And there at least it's voluntary, so you have the chance to like really think about it. But they go into this idea of like, but if you've grown up all your life being a mutant and maybe being hated by that, but at least still forming an identity because of it, like, who are you without it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think with athletes, it's like athletes lose their powers at some point, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if your power is to hit a baseball 400 feet, and not just a baseball, but like a baseball thrown at velocity with spin and, ridiculous major league pitching, like, you're not going to have that ability for the rest of your life.
Right.
And so forming your entire identity around that, like, then you're like someone who used to do that. And it's like, sure, that's how most people are going to see you because that's what you did, right? And then maybe they see you on Dancing with the Stars or something. I don't know. but like, it does seem like you would want people to have something beyond that. And I think a lot of athletes do find something later in life beyond that, or not even just athletes, but anyone who has a career that has sort of a limit, in terms of how long you can perform at the highest level. And
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to me is a really interesting example because he's someone who, I mean, his abilities will fade. His knees are not as good, but like he's always going to be 7 foot tall or whatever, 7'1", 7'2".
Yeah.
But like he's really made this transition where now he like does a lot of political and social commentary and he writes books and stuff like that. And he seems like, I feel like he wouldn't have the microphone that he has without having been a great sports star. But he's been able to use that to really kind of like transition into this other life beyond that I think is very difficult for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he basically had something else that he wanted to do, right? That was important to him, and he was able to leverage his earlier success for future success and future influence, really, in what I think is a really important way. He also had an acting career. Let's not.
Oh yeah, that's right. He was in a couple of movies. I don't like to think about, because the other athlete I think about who had a big acting career was O.J. Simpson, who is not, I think, an example of someone doing well after athletics.
I mean, he's an example of someone doing things and having a very different identity after professional sports. Kind of took the opposite direction.
But I think you could use, and again, we'll get back to the actual story here, but I think that's the point, is that all this is a metaphor. And I think the boys especially, O.J. Simpson, I think, is, again, I don't know his sociology, I don't know his psychology, but from what I've read, like, he is someone who had this, like, he grew up always being told he was a hero and always being told that whatever he wanted he could have, and that, like, when you're part of that kind of victim culture, that kind of hero culture,
right?
You get there's incredibly high numbers of professional athletes, either current or former, who wind up being like abusive to their partners or otherwise violent, or because you grow up in this attitude. And again, it's not to justify any of it, but it explains it, I think, in part, of like, you grow up in this attitude of like, you can have everything you want, you're never wrong. And it's, again, Legend of Korra was a kids show, and everything of Avatar was meaning to be like, positive and kind of happy, and it was very much not a grim, dark show. But I think if you ever wanted to tell like a grim, dark story in the Avatar world, this would be one of the things to explore, is like, what happens to the Bender who loses their powers? Or even like, what happens to the Bender who just like, because in that world, bending is basically kind of martial art. So what, like, they have arthritis and they can't do the hand motions as well. What happens to them, and how do they pretty much all become drunks, or like whatever it is?
Right.
Like, that's a great story to explore that Nickelodeon's probably not going to tell that story.
Probably not. But there would be a lot of blood bending in it if it were a grimdark bending show.
I think we're going to move on to actually discussing how Korra explores this and why, at least I thought it was problematic. But I want to kind of raise one other thing, and I'm going to I've referenced this before, but I think it's good to bring up. The TV show Babylon 5, which I'm not going to have any big spoilers for it, but it's also, I think, more than 20 years old, so I'm not feeling too bad about spoilers. But if you ever want to see, it is...
I've never seen it.
It is fantastic storytelling, amazing plot, amazing characters, with some of the cheesiest dialogue and special effects you'll ever see in science fiction. So it's a struggle. But one of the central ideas of that story is that humans have, at some point later in the future, developed telepathy. And here they do really go into the question of, like, why would people be afraid of telepaths, and all the ways in which telepaths could be terrifying. They could be the perfect spies. They could manipulate people in relationships. They could win every gambling possibility or every business deal, you know. But so they start with that, but then it kind of goes into, like, the Magneto worst nightmare, where telepaths are now incredibly regulated in that world, and they have to wear gloves all the time, because if they could touch another person, they could read them much better. And, like, they can't ever be involved in gambling. They can't ever be involved in business. They can just do other things. And they're really treated, like, the fear that telepaths would treat everyone else as second-class citizens results in a world where the telepaths are treated as second-class citizens. Yeah. Which, to me, I mean, I think that's exactly Magneto's concern. And I think that's I think it's a real concern of if you have a large number of people who are afraid of these people who have powers, finding equality is going to be really hard. It's either going to be one group's on top, or you're so scared of that the other group wants up on top.
Yeah, I mean, like, in our world, you know, we have, I think, the problem of basically oligarchs and then, you know, everyone else. And to me, that seems like a much easier problem to solve that we still can't solve in today's society, because apparently there's never really been an appetite to, well, maybe it's not an easier problem, because what happens is when you have leftist revolutions that ostensibly aim to remove that oligarchy, what you often will end up with is just basically a new oligarchy.
Right.
That, you know, says that's not what it is, but, like, when you really look at it on paper, you're like, yeah, but you small handful of people have this massive amount of power, and everybody else still has what they had. Right. And so yeah, it's hard in real life, but, you know, in our world, there's power in the form of wealth can be removed, right? Yeah. That's a thing that actually can be done. And in the form of, you know, ability to govern, absolute power, like, when people just say no, then that power dissipates, right?
Right.
I mean, and that takes great effort, and that takes changing minds, but it's possible. Whereas in a world where people have these just inherent abilities, it's like you can't, like, tax someone's bending,
right?
Right. Although, like, maybe you can.
Yeah, I think to me, like, if you look at it, like, we can't stop the fact that some people are white and some people aren't. Like, that's not, right. We can't change that. I don't think we should. But the fact that whiteness has more power and privilege is completely a social construction, because there's nothing inherently about being white that makes someone any, you know, better or different or anything like that. It's just these awful prejudices we've grown up with. But, like, a waterbender can literally do it. And like you said, like, money is a real thing, but we can equalize that to some extent.
Yeah.
Bending is not, like, there's a social construction that puts benders on pedestals, or puts someone like Superman on a pedestal. But, like, the fact that Superman can fly and most of us can't, that's not a social construction. You know, that is. The fact that Professor X can read people's minds in a way that the rest of us can, like, that's a literal difference in a way that the rest of us don't have.
Right. Exactly. The way, you know, Kareem being 7 feet tall or 7 foot whatever is a real thing. We're not going to be like, oh, let's just bring you down a foot. But that's, you know, in terms of basketball, it's basically like a superpower. In terms of everything else in the world, I mean, I imagine actually it's very inconvenient in a lot of the rest of the world, like buying clothes, walking through doorways, sitting in cars. Like,
I used to sell cars for a living, and we had someone who was, I think he was a basketball player at the university. Yeah. He was at least 6'8".
Yeah.
And finding a car he could fit in was a very difficult thing.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, there's ways in which, our society doesn't accommodate for people who are, outliers in certain ways. And, where they may have advantages in other ways. But, like, bending or, like, the ability to fly or, any of these really, outsized powers, there certainly aren't any easy answers to that, but I'd like to see something deal with the idea in a... I'd like to see someone try,
Like, I think it's great. Yeah, I think it's great that you brought up Buffy earlier with the Xander reference. Because here's an example where I feel like they try, and it's a kind of cool moment, but when you think about it, you're also like, this kind of is also making it worse. Because what Buffy does is... and again, I'm not going to... spoilers for the last episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is 20 years old by now as well. Or some arbitrary number of years old. I'm bad with numbers.
It's probably like 17.
Paul and I used to have a concept called Math for my playful ability to the numbers. But the point is, like, Buffy does this really cool, because in that world, there's a whole bunch of people who are potentially slayers with all this incredible power. But most of them are never, like, activated. And so Buffy does this ritual to activate all these people and basically give all these people their special powers. And, and at first you think about it, and it's awesome, and, like, they get to defeat the evil, and all these women get to have these incredible powers. And it's everything from, like, people fighting to, like, kids who are being picked on by bullies to the one moment I often think about of a girl who looks like she's not a traditional athlete. She's picked on probably, and she's, at bat in Little League, and, like, we see her, like, miss a pitch, and then there's the moment that happens, everyone gets, their powers, and you see a smile on her face as she digs down at the plate, and you're sure that now she's going to hit the ball 600 feet. And do I want to see that character get empowered? Absolutely. Do I think that she should now be playing Little League if she has the power supernaturally granted to hit a ball 600 feet? I don't think that's fair. Like,
right. Although, okay. Here's the thing, though. Like, it's the idea that it's supernaturally granted the issue, or is the idea that she's such an outlier such an issue? Like, because, I mean, everybody has different abilities, right? And when it comes to things like sports, I mean, this is sort of just like an issue with sport itself, is that, sort of what's the point of these competitions, and, like, it's really a tiny fraction of people who, I mean, okay, we don't know necessarily how much of it is training, like skill, and how much of it is physical ability, right? Like, genetic or, like what you ate or whatever, basically. But, it's reasonable to think that, if you're 5'2", you're going to have a hard time in certain sports having a career as a professional athlete.
Right.
And the majority of, like, big money sports tend to favor, people over a certain height, right? People whose frames are going to develop a certain amount of muscle. And, the way sports are constructed actually does it.
And in some sports, it's the exact opposite. Like, to be a gymnast, especially a female gymnast, you often have to have a very small, small frame to be able to be successful. But yeah,
for
still,
sure,
like,
you can't be too tall.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right, and it's interesting, like, because especially, like, I mean, part of the point that we're supposed to be seeing in Buffy is it's the idea of, women who have been, in a very patriarchal society, not given the same power, not given the same abilities, and then often, like, the fact that, on average, men tend to be bigger or stronger is used as a kind of power against women. Like, that this moment balances that. And I think, in part, that Little League moment is awesome because of that. Because it's like, this girl who isn't necessarily as physically gifted as the other kids on the playground, especially the boy who's pitching. Like, great, she has that. But, like, what about the girl who's in the middle of, like, an 8th grade, girls' basketball game? Like, now one of those... Because that's the thing, is it's like, to me, it has to be universal. You know, if you
Right.
give powers to a
Yeah.
larger group, that's great, but now you still have this disparity between the powered and the non-powered.
Yeah, and I mean, because basically what you've done there is instead of making people more equal physically, you've basically taken a small number of people who, you know, on average were somewhat less physically powerful and made them just the most physically powerful, right? Where, I mean, I think, you know, that girl in Little League could probably, has probably more physical power than, you know, the strongest adults, right? Who aren't also slayers. And, you know, that, I mean, and that's always I mean, if you brought all those people kind of up to the level or up a little higher than the level of the most powerful adults, it's like, okay, you know, maybe we've kind of made things a little bit more balanced, or, you know, we've shifted where some people are with some other people, and you know, I think there's certainly nothing really harmful there. But when you know, when some people then get that much more powerful than anyone else, you know, you do have to wonder, like, what kind of society is that going to result in?
And I think that's the interesting point, is like, how could we, you know, one of the ways might be that you try to use super science to give everybody the same powers,
right?
And maybe that can work, maybe it can't. And I think we definitely sometimes have like villains who that's their evil plan, and the problem is that it would actually create, you know, more problems, or a lot of people would die. But like, if your plan is like, it's bad that some people have powers, let's give all them powers, like that's a good way to equalize it. But if not, if you can't do that, then you at least have to have some way to be like, let's have the society recognize that, because in a lot of ways, to me, I think of it's privilege. And what I really have a problem is when the powered people don't seem to understand why non-powered people would resent them, and so treat it as bad. Which go ahead and respond to, and I think that's actually a really good segue to that. Let's dive more into Korra and why this first season, I think, is not the best way of handling these questions.
Just go right into Korra.
Okay, so the other part of what I didn't say about it, so the way the story plays out in Korra is this group called the Equalizers come up, and I'll tell you about my own journey with the show. The first couple episodes, I was like, this is going to be my favorite show of all time, because we start out by seeing Korra. You know, in the first set of Avatar stories, we had Aang as this 12-year-old boy who comes from like Buddhist monks, and so he's silly and he's immature, but he also has this kind of like wise, enlightened aspect to him. Korra is 100% an angsty emo teenager, and I think that's great. I think a lot of people don't like her character for that. I think it's a great part of her character, but you know, she has all these powers and she doesn't have a sense of responsibility. So in the first episode, we see her. You know, people rob a store, and while trying to track them down, she destroys like 5 other buildings as part of fighting them. You know, and she does all this collateral damage, and she's challenged with like, you know, why should you shouldn't have done that? You were wrong to do that. And then, as we meet the Equalizers, a lot of them have similar complaints of like, you know, that firebender like saved things by burning down all the buildings on my block, or like, you know, I got injured by this. I was so excited for it. But then what happens is, very quickly, the Equalizers are turned into more of a cult. And I think this is the power that writing can have. Like, you could have written this story in a way that the Equalizers are very sympathetic, and they clearly have a point, even if maybe their methods are a little bit too extreme, so therefore they're the villains, but we can sympathize with them. And I think like a Killmonger from Black Panther is a great example of that. Yeah. You know, the fact that like by the end of Black Panther, T'Challa has realized, like, Killmonger was right in some ways. That's not the story they give us here. Instead, they show us the Equalizers as a cult, that they're doing this terrible thing, because their main thing is that they can remove people's bending. And then as the story goes on, and they're just doing horrible things. They're terrorists. They're killing innocent people. They destroy anybody who disagrees with them or stands in their way. And then the real icing on the cake is, and again, here's one of the big spoilers, for Korra Season 1, go ahead and skip ahead. Well, we're going to talk about this for a while, so go stop, watch Korra, etc.
Watch this show.
Or just keep listening if you don't want to watch it, but you want to understand what we're talking about. It's revealed that their leader, Amon, is actually a complete hypocrite. He's a bender himself. He has this kind of personal vendetta against other benders, and that's why he's doing all this. And so the result of it is that we, the audience, come away thinking that the idea of criticizing the Benders or wanting to take down the Benders a few pegs is actually kind of ridiculous, and that the world in which the Benders have the power they do is actually the right way to have the world be. And even more important, the characters never have that moment of self-reflection. Like, they never have that moment that T'Challa has. T'Challa, how does it actually pronounce? Is it T'Challa or T'Challa?
I think it's T'Challa.
Okay. They never have that moment that he has, or that like sometimes even Professor X can have, or others, of being like, Korra never has a moment of, I can understand why non-Benders don't like me, and the other characters don't have this moment of like, how can we make for a fairer world? It's just, nope, the idea of criticizing us is stupid. These people should know their place. Everything goes back to normal.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that was one of the best things about Black Panther, from a sort of story standpoint, like construction of the story, is that it had a villain who had a very legitimate point and had a, maybe not so great solution to the very real problem, right? And so the hero fights against and defeats the villain, but then takes some of that viewpoint, is like, okay, basically, like, I hear you, and I'm going to try to fight against what, I'm going to make changes in the way that you were suggesting making changes, but, like, I'm going to do it in a little different way,
Right.
And I think most really good villains, or a lot, often have a point, right? Yeah. Like, they should usually have a viewpoint that, at a minimum, makes sense with their story. And here, okay, like, we understand that there's this personal motivation, but when the villain isn't, and not even the villain, like so he's a villain, I'd say, right, Alan? Right. But the movement is like the antagonist in a way, right? Yeah. And having an antagonist that has a point, like, has a what happens to all those people when he's outed as a bloodbender? Like, I mean, I think the movement kind of fractures, and there's still some people kind of, pushing it, but not as effectively, I guess. Right. But it really is like, if the heroes don't kind of learn something, or if the protagonists don't learn something from the villain or the antagonist who has a legitimate point, I feel like that's a wasted opportunity. And I mean, I'll say I enjoyed The Legend of Korra, I think maybe more than you did. I think, I wanted to enjoy it. I wasn't really digging too deeply into it. Okay. The art is amazing. Yeah, and the world building, there's a lot of kind of like fan service. This character is descended from that character kind of thing, like blah, blah, blah. Which, kind of makes for some moments where like, oh, but then it's kind of like, well, I don't know. It almost speaks to, the point of like, what, so all of these important characters are descendants of other important characters. So it's like everybody else just like doesn't matter that much, or,
yeah. It's like that Star Wars problem of every important character right. has to be part of one of these like three families.
Yeah, exactly. And but having said that, I really enjoyed season 3 a lot more than season 1, and I feel like it treats kind of the same principle differently and better. But here in season 1, like, people have a real issue. Like, the heroes really are doing, damage. Like, yeah. And the society really is inequitable. And that's like brought up as a serious concern. And then it's kind of like, sidestepped. And not really addressed in a way that, I think when your protagonist is like 17, that's a show that's written or created for kids who are a little older than a show where your protagonist was 12.
Yeah.
And so I think, they had license to go a little deeper, I think, and should have. And, I guess a spoiler for the original series, if any of the listeners haven't seen it before listening to this podcast, at the end, Aang is basically faced with the, decision of like how is he going to go about stopping just an exceptionally powerful bender, right? And he figures out he can take away their bending. And to me, that seems like a very reasonable way to deal with an individual who is like basically destroying the world, right?
Right.
When you look at the whole society, it's like, can you take away the power of all of the benders? First of all, that's a lot of people. And second of all, that is a part of all these people's identity. And it's not like they're all going around causing harm.
Right.
So, maybe something that was more targeted. That's like, well, these people are abusing their bending. And if someone's abusing their bending, then we're going to maybe you can take it away temporarily. And,
right.
It's almost like a prison sentence, except it's not.
Right. Well, and that gets into those questions of like, but is it okay to be like, you have this special power that you didn't choose, you didn't ask for, but you have it and used it badly, so we're going to take away,
right.
Because what if like that is, you keep your house warm because of your fire bending or, something like that.
Right.
Going to the point you made about Korra being a teenager, I think that that's exactly the point. Like, this would have been such a great time to tell a story about a teenager who's been raised since she was a very young girl, told, you are going to be the most powerful bender on the planet. You are the hero. You are the best person in the world. You're great. You're wonderful because of these powers that you have. And I think part of why I felt so almost betrayed by it is like the first couple episodes, we see that. We see her having this moment of having to be like, wait, I was always told everything was perfect. And now maybe I'm doing harm. Do I need to think about like that would have been such an interesting thing to see a teenager go through.
Yeah.
But instead I feel like, and I will say again, avoiding any spoilers, later seasons of Korra, I think, are much better, especially season 3, because they do try to sort of redo this question, and it does feel like the writers kind of realize they got it wrong, and from a very different perspective, but we have a character who clearly is unhappy about the state of the world, and their story is told in a way that is much more sympathetic to them. But we still don't get those moments of Korra, like, and I understand we may get that more towards the end of the show, but at least in season 1, we don't have... Korra, I think, doesn't come out of it in any way feeling like, maybe I take for granted my bending powers and I should think more about the people who don't and how what we do affects them.
Right.
Which would have been such a good story.
Yeah, I agree. And there is... I think the story has... the series has an arc. I never got to season 4, unfortunately, so I don't know the completion of that arc. I think you're somewhere in season 4, right?
Yeah, I'm like 4 episodes into season 4.
Okay, yeah. So, I like sometimes. I think a lot of shows, can do their best work towards the end. If they're trying to kind of paint this broad arc, and I'd like to leave room for that. Maybe that happens towards the end, but yeah, I agree that just there's it's kind of a lost opportunity in that regard. In season 1, also they made the seasons shorter than for The Last Airbender, which I'm not entirely certain why they went about that, why they did it that way, whether that was more Nickelodeon or, and that's one thing that kind of a sort of a little bit of a caveat sort of footnote is that when shows are a certain way and deal with certain things or don't deal with certain things, a lot of times, especially with shows that were on television and not just native to a streaming platform, I think a lot of times where the responsibility or blame or credit goes is sort of spread out. Like you don't always know, like, I mean, I know originally they wanted, Korra to be a girl, right? Or a teen, a woman. And the network was like, no, we don't think boys will watch, a show with a female protagonist. And they're like, no, right, yeah, exactly. And like, they won that battle. Like, we don't know what other things maybe they wanted to. I'm not going to assume that they did, but I'm certainly going to allow for the possibility that the show was 12 episodes and maybe could have delved into some things that maybe they were given notes like, oh, maybe let's not do that.
Well, do you know about the moment where they lost that fight? Because there's something that happens at the very end of season 4 that is.
I don't want to know as a spoiler, but
okay, it's talked about on the internet all the time.
If you want to broaden,
I think it's relevant here. The people who know what I'm talking about will understand. There's a direction that the writers clearly wanted the show to go, and they actually, like, it's floating around. There's footage that they wrote to make it go in that direction, and the authors said you can't. The producers said you can't do that. They had to cut it, and so it is not quite that. So, but yeah, and I think that's always a thing. Is like, what's the pressure from the fans? What's the pressure from the producers? I mean, to me, one of my other favorite examples of this, and I talk about it all the time on the Star Wars Universe podcast, but of where we have an antagonist that I thought would have been so much better if we understand their point of view, is the Separatists from the prequels of Star Wars. Like, we see all this exploration of why the Republic is failing and the Republic is not great. I could totally understand why a planet would want to break away from the Republic. Like, look at Naboo. Naboo got invaded. The Republic did nothing. They had to save themselves. I would think Naboo would be the head of the Separatist movement. Like,
right.
know? But in that instead, they just make the Count Dooku is very much an Amon in that he's just a hypocrite. He's just working for Darth Sidious. Spoiler warning. Sorry. And I feel like, just again, it just makes it such dumb storytelling because there's no moments of reflection and there's no complexity. And to me, Korra is the exact same. At least season 1. Again, I think it does get better in later seasons.
Are there concrete ways that you could see either this story or another story really addressing kind of this central issue?
I think I don't want to make this too PC, although I definitely lean in that direction. And I know that some folks have trouble with the concept of privilege, and I think that there are sometimes ways that it's applied in ways that don't make sense or it's not explained well. But I think, honestly, that even if you don't use the word, the concepts behind the idea of privilege, I think, would be a really good thing. Because I think in the same way that, like, I have myself personally never been afraid of the cops the way that I can understand a person of color for very legitimate reasons would be. And so I've learned how to understand this, but I might not understand the instinctual, like, fear of a cop coming into my neighborhood in the same way. And I feel like I've had to make a conscious effort to say, let me understand what I don't understand. Let me understand that I have always come from a upper middle class family, and I've always had, I've definitely been personally poor, but I've always known that there were economic resources in my family that I could fall back on. And so I've never had to make the economic choices that some other people have had. Let me try and remember that as I look at their decisions. I think if Benders were to take that moment to really say, like, wait a minute, we never think about how hard it must be to be in a world where we have this power and others don't. How can we, like, take action to fix that? How can we can't give them the power, we can't take away our own, and frankly, like, you take all the Earthbenders' powers away, you lose 3/4 of the world's architecture, and, like, buildings are good.
Right.
But, like, even if it was just like, how could we be thoughtful about the collateral damage that we're having? Like Korra having this attitude of, my job is to stop the criminals, and so anything and everything I do to stop the criminals is always okay.
Is that a problem in the real world?
Yeah, just a bit. I mean, like, it's a big joke in the series, but, like, there's some poor cabbage farmer who is probably bankrupt by now because his cabbages keep getting knocked in the air. It's a joke from the first Avatar series, but yeah,
my cabbages. Yeah,
that's now the outro. But I think that's exactly what we're getting at. I think that would be a really good step, as if there were ways in which we do have this sport in Legend of Korra that's all about bending and like people's power to bend. Okay, let's really try to also have a sport that doesn't involve bending. And like you said, where bending is forbidden. Let's try to maybe develop a national identity that's not built on the superpowers that some people in your world have that not everybody has. I think that's the thing, is like in the same way that whiteness is a social construction, the physical ability to bend is not a social construction. But I think the concept of benders as like the high point of the society and the people who take care of things and the heroes or possibly the villains, I think that's a social construction. And I think you could do a lot of work to change the societal understanding of bending and how it fits.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's important to remember that, like, we can never know exactly what someone else has gone through, what they're going through, but that we should always seek to understand that when people tell us, what their lives are like, we should listen.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you always have to take everybody 100% at their word, right?
Right.
Because, obviously in the world there are some number of bad faith actors. But, by and large, especially when anybody tells you, hey, this is how I feel about this, or this is what's happened to me, like, generally you should give them the benefit of the doubt. Yeah. And when large groups of people say, oh yeah, that happened to me, this has happened to me, this is how I feel, then it's, there's a point at which it's like, okay, well, that's very clearly something that's happening. Like, it's not some vast conspiracy. And so, when the equalists basically are all like, hey, we feel oppressed in this society, like, it's really incumbent upon the benders to listen, right? Number one, stop and listen. And then try and come up with solutions, and listen to the equalists say, well, what solutions are you proposing? And if the equalists are like, well, we want to take away all your bending and throw you all in jail, it's like, okay, maybe not that, right? Like, what else can we do? Like,
in some regard, this is the central theme of Captain America: Civil War,
Yeah,
and
very much.
When the mother of those boys who died in Sokovia comes to Tony Stark and yells at him, he clearly listens. And
yes,
I feel like the whole movie is about the solution to the problem.
Yes.
But everyone acknowledges there's a problem. Everyone acknowledges that, the heroes are taking actions that they should, but that they're not careful enough about the collateral damage, and that I think that for Korra, this wouldn't have been perfect, but something that you could do to make it still a kid's show and not go too deep. What if, the last 10 minutes of the last episode, even the last 5 minutes, had been, our heroes all celebrating, they won, and then someone, I'd hope it'd be Korra, but maybe it's one of the older folks, saying, yeah, Amon was just a hypocrite and he was terrible, but he convinced those people because they had some legitimate reasons. And, that character helps encourage the others, and, our final scene is, a couple of the big power benders sitting down with some people who were big in the equalist movement and saying, listen, Amon was terrible. We know you don't want to be terrorists, but clearly there were reasons you were upset. We want to hear those reasons, and it just ends with that. That 5 minutes it wouldn't have fixed everything, but it would have made me feel so much better about all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that would work. I think having, some character beats throughout of, especially because you have all the angsty teen self-questioning, right? All the self-doubt. I feel like that would have been a really reasonable thing to have self-doubt about. Not just oh, I'm supposed to be the avatar, everything isn't going right, am I good enough, whatever. How's my airbending coming along? But is it good that there's an avatar? What does it mean? What does it mean to be the avatar? Because the avatar is the ultimate position of privilege in that world, right? Where this one person is born with just more power than anyone else can have.
Right.
And so, some reflection on that, I think, would be very powerful.
I'm going to leave it very broad. There are people who have seen the whole show who are probably wondering why we're not talking about later seasons. Some of the questions we're discussing now do get addressed in later seasons, but you're right, definitely not in this as well. And yeah, I mean, I read a lot of discussion about Korra, and I think a lot of people don't like her, and I think a lot of it is.
I like her.
Yeah, no, I think she's a great character. I think a lot of the dislike of Korra is from a sexist place, which I think is unfortunate. It's a lot like the same stuff that happens to Rey and characters like that.
Yeah.
And I think some of it is, and again, there's probably a sexist idea to this, but also it's a different thing of like, part of why people like Aang was like, he has a couple of moments of like childish insecurity, but for the most part, he's pretty focused on who he is and his values, and he doesn't waver from those. And Korra is very much the opposite, and I like that about her because she does question everything. And so yeah, I hadn't even thought about this until now, but it now seems like she is so like vigilant to criticism, not vigilant, but like she's so sensitive to criticism. And she's so interested in like, you know, she's very defensive about it, but she's very quick. Like, you know, when someone attacks her, she gets defensive, like mentally, with words, I mean, but you can tell it still eats at her. And so the fact that she doesn't spend this season kind of being like, but do the Iglis have a point? You know, did I do too much collateral damage? She does some of that at the start, but nowhere near as much as the season goes on.
Like, it seems like she'd be the perfect character for that storyline. Yeah.
Well, let me throw that question back to you then. So how would you, in a world like Korra or any of these other worlds, you know, what do you think could be done to kind of build a more just society where you do have, I mean, to some extent, like two different species. Like they often, in the X-Men, they talk about how like they're not really Homo sapiens anymore. They're kind of a Homo mutations or something, whatever it is.
Homo superioris or something.
Yeah, that's not a problematic name.
Right.
But yeah, like, how do you think you could build a society where some people are going to have that huge difference?
Yeah, I would have liked to have prepared like some really coherent, straightforward, actionable suggestion, but I think it's not an intractable problem, but it's a problem that's harder to solve than problems that we have in our own world, which I have a lot of suggestions, like a long list. But in a world where you have something like bending, you know, I mean, do you have something like a bending tax where, like, you know, people, I mean, how do economics work, right? When, you know, some people can labor, like, how long would it take to build a statue if you're not an earthbender, right? Or to make a statue? And then how long would it take if you are an earthbender? How long, like, I guess there's just nobody makes houses, you know, like if they're not an earthbender or out of stone. Nobody builds buildings out of stone. I mean, so it's but at the same time, it's like when there are people that have those sorts of powers, that's work that doesn't need to be done by other people. So theoretically, you should be able to build a better world if maybe, you know, there's certain, you know, you create a you know, more egalitarian society in terms of like the allocation of resources, and you know, you create fantastic public buildings.
And even that though can get into some very bad places. And I know that you don't mean this, but I think some science fiction shows have definitely explored this. Of like, okay, so if you say we don't need people to learn masonry because the benders are going to build all the buildings, that can lead to slave labor pretty darn quickly. Like, do the benders get a choice? What about the bender who's like, screw architecture, I just want to go lie in the... Or like, I can bend, but I'd rather just go be an accountant or a musician. Like, you know, it
has to be an opportunity, not a conscription.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's like people in our world with, you know, really amazing athletic ability, like, don't all necessarily want to play a game for a living, you know? And so not all do, but many do, because they look at it and like, well, I can do this thing for millions a year potentially, or I can do this other thing for like $9 an hour. And it you know, people do end up getting kind of sort of coerced into certain certain fields maybe.
I mean, I've certainly known people, and I'm sure you have as well. I think it's almost a cliche joke at this point. You know, if you have a friend who's more than like 6'6" tall, you know, they're like 6'8", 6'10", and they don't play basketball, they probably, at least in high school and college and into their 20s or 30s, had a lot of people asking them, somewhat jokingly, somewhat not, well, why don't you play basketball? Like, you have this height, so clearly that's the like thing you're supposed to do. And like, you know, so I'm like, no, I want to be a poet, or I want to just, you know, design computers or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think like the main thing is like, honestly, it almost doesn't matter to some extent what powers people have. Like, if there is accountability for when people use their powers, whatever they are, destructively, and if there is opportunity for everybody, right, and you know, I mean, I don't get the sense that in Republic City, or you know, in the Korra, the world of Korra, that there's a complete lack of opportunity for everybody else. I mean, there could be more, you know. It could be worse that way. Like, does everybody have food? You know, does...
there's not the privations that we saw in Ba Sing Se, an earlier city. You know, it does seem like there isn't, like... You know, we do meet a homeless person. Like, there's some people who are not in great shape, but I don't think it's like... I was going to say it's more like our world. It's not dystopian levels, but... I mean,
no.
Our world is pretty much a dystopia at this point.
For sure. I mean, it seems like a better world than our world, right?
Yeah.
Like, in a lot of ways. And, but that's the thing. It's like, oh, you're homeless. You don't have a house. Do you want a house? Like, we can have a committee of, you know, volunteers or people who are paid by the city or the government or whatever to just build you a house in like 5 minutes.
Right.
You know? And that's the thing, is that you can use those powers for good and in a way that benefits everybody. And, you know, the people who have exceptional powers can be rewarded with something for using those exceptional powers for good. Maybe have another sport that there isn't bending in, you know.
Right.
But the thing is, it's like, that just makes for good TV, right? Like bending. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, it's flashy. That's why we have so many shows with a lot of violence.
You were talking before about how, like, what's interesting is the combat powers, and like, I think in this world they've established, like, there are waterbenders who are perfectly happy to just figure out how to use waterbending to irrigate crops, you know, and there are firebenders who, you know, hang out in the furnaces and like help to build those things, and those stories aren't as interesting. Although I will say that it's just a throwaway moment, but there's a moment in Legend of Korra where one of our hero characters, who's a firebender, is shown when he's kind of in a tough economic situation, like what looks like almost like a in 1800s, like sweaty, really hot, topless, you know, not wearing a shirt, like, you know, shoveling coal into a furnace. He looks like he's in just that miserable position. He's just firebending into a furnace instead, which I thought was another, like, yeah, not even them are all treated great.
Right, exactly. And, you know, that kind of comes down to the economic system, right? Like, what is their economic system? Like, is it unfettered capitalism?
Right.
Like, do they have a way of actually making sure that everybody has enough? And, I mean, I think stories of that aren't focused around, you know, the violent conflict, but featuring people with outstanding abilities, you know, like bending in this case, could certainly be perfectly interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, how much violence is there in the episode Tales of Ba Sing Se in the original series?
Yeah, I don't think there's any at all.
I don't think there's any. It's arguably the best episode of the series.
There's like 20 seconds of one character getting mugged, and that character like defeats the mugger, but then tells him like important life lessons. And I think that's the only like violence that we see.
Exactly. And, you know, there's obviously the important death that's relevant, you know, that came through violence.
I will actually say that there's no violence, but there's a very important conflict, because there is the most like cutting edge haiku off that I've ever seen.
That's true. That's a brutal haiku off.
One of the most brilliant moments I've ever seen in any television show ever.
Lyrical violence.
I like it.
Very sharp words.
Yeah. Cool. I think that kind of is we kind of covered a lot of things I wanted to cover. What else? Was there other questions you wanted to delve into or points you wanted to make?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, there's some specific things like bloodbending and like why is that so verboten, but like
Right.
you know, it might be a bet like if you have to restrain someone, like wouldn't it be better to bloodbend them than like hit them with a fireball?
Yeah.
But you know, I think we dealt with the real, you know, the heart of the issue, which you know I think leads to as many questions as more questions than answers. But
Right.
just when you're writing villains with sympathetic viewpoints or with like legitimate points to make, like I think it's really important that the heroes, or that the protagonists take those issues seriously, and if they can kind of come away changed, like as having kind of absorbed some of the antagonist's viewpoint, I think that can be very powerful.
Yeah, I agree with you there, and I think that's, to me, there's two kind of stories I want to see more of. One is where the heroes are powered people, and the people critiquing them are maybe going a little too far, but still our heroes take seriously the critiques and try to adjust and learn from them. But what I also want to see more of, and this is what The Boys is, and I'm trying to think of other shows that do this. I can't think of that many. Although, listeners, if you do, please write in and give us more examples. I think it's explored more in books, but where the protagonists are the people who aren't the powered ones,
Right.
The Boys, I think, being the best example of that, but I think that I'd love to see others like that. I'm totally blanking, but can you think of any other movies or TV shows off the bat where that's the case?
I cannot. I can't. Well, maybe like Supernatural. I don't know. Do they have powers?
I mean, they have the power
I haven't
of
ever
plot
seen
armor,
it, actually.
which is perhaps the most powerful superpower out there. But
Of course.
You're right.
I mean, I guess I would say like the whole like category of like vampire hunter type stuff.
Right.
But what?
But
what
I guess
I would.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I forgot what I was going to say, so you go.
I think you're right there, but I think I would put it. Maybe I should further twist what I'm asking for. Is I think we have stories where there are people who have evil powers and are using them for evil reasons to do, and so our heroes are the unpowered ones fighting for justice as the plucky underdog.
And it's just clear.
Yeah. I more mean worlds in which most of the people in the world believe that the powered people are good and are right. And our heroes are the ones who are like, I don't think that's true. I think we need to kind of like pull the... Like, the book The Reckoners do that. The TV show The Boys does that. I'm blanking on others.
Yeah, I mean, so this is an example that doesn't actually involve powered people, but like, you get a ton of Batman stories where the police are basically trying to capture Batman or trying to figure out who he is. And similar thing with Spider-Man, and this often it's a common theme of you have a vigilante, and then you have generally law enforcement, but it doesn't have to be law enforcement. It could be other protagonists. Well, what I'd like to see is some sort of show about sort of like a masked vigilante who could have powers, and that's like a mystery. Basically, the protagonists are trying to figure out who they are, and maybe they're going around doing things that are good but are bad. But it's like, how do you deal with it? And we just don't have much where the unpowered characters are the protagonists,
right.
But the powered character, but everyone powered isn't like an antagonist.
Yeah, there's one example I can think of where there's only one person in the story who is powered, and they are a protagonist, but the hero and the point of view character is not powered, and so we're seeing like this powered person from a normal person's eyes, and that's Sherlock Holmes. And yeah, Holmes is not technically powered, but his intelligence and his deductive skills are basically a superpower.
Yeah, totally.
And like in the shows and the movies, like it's hard to have you have two characters on screen. They're both kind of like the point of view characters.
Right.
But it's certainly told more from Watson's perspective. But especially in the books, I've only read a couple of them, and I read them many years ago. But my memory is that we get Watson's internal dialogues. We don't get Sherlock Holmes's. So we do get much more of a normal person experiencing basically a powered person as they act in the world. And then a lot of the story, often in humorous ways, often in serious ways, and this does come out in the movies and TV shows, is the way that Watson can get very frustrated with Sherlock in the way that he doesn't accept that everybody else has his powers and thus treats them like, oh, you're an idiot for not being able to do the thing that I can only do because my brain is this genetic marvel or whatever it is.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think Watson is actually the first-person narrator of most of the Sherlock stories.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
So yeah, we get his thoughts, and then we eventually get Sherlock's thoughts, but it is very much this sort of unpowered character's view of like what's going on, where the powered character, but and then Moriarty's kind of like another powered character, right? Basically. Yeah. So there is this struggle between them that we're not privy to on a first-person basis. It's second person, not second person, it's third person, but it's like right there. He's like right next to him. And yeah, I think that's an interesting and sometimes powerful way of telling a story.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true. So, writers in Hollywood, I'm sure you all are avid listeners to this podcast. Take note. Give us more shows like The Boys, maybe without quite so much gore and violence and crassness. I mean, I love those things, but, there could be a Nickelodeon version of The Boys.
Exactly.
Exactly. So, all right, well, Paul, thank you so much, as always, for being on this. To our fans, what do you think? What are the examples we missed? I know that, particularly my perspective, although it sounds like, Paul, you're so in agreement with me, but, I've talked about my feelings on Season 1 of Korra on some Avatar fan groups and gotten a lot of people who do not agree with me. So I'd be curious, are others coming out of the woodwork and they were also troubled by this? Or do you totally disagree and think, tell me a different reason why, what did we miss? That there's reasons why the powered people are fine and the benders shouldn't be questioning themselves the way we're talking about. Would love to hear it. Would love to hear any of those kind of thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and on Twitter at Superhero Ethics. And we will put up a post. You can post anywhere, but we'll put up a post specifically about this episode that you can then respond to and talk about that way. Excuse me. So you can do that. You can also email us, superheroethics@gmail.com. We'll be happy to read your email on air. But also if you say, look, we just want to send you these thoughts. We don't want you to read it on air. That's fine too. Either way, but we'll just love the engagement. We're starting to get a lot of engagement on the Star Wars Universe podcast. Would love to really start to add more of that on here. So, but please keep listening. Please keep sharing this with your friends. Write those reviews. And please, whatever powers you do or don't have, be a hero. Have a good day.
Cool.